Hi, everyone. We're just a couple of minutes early right now. So it's just 7 now. So let's just give a couple more minutes to let any stragglers in, and then we will get started because we have a pretty full agenda today. We would just ask that you leave your microphones on mute so that we can get through everything, and we can take some questions and such in the chat, and there will be a Q&A opportunity later on in the presentation as well.
Just let in a few more people.
All right, I say since it's just 7 and we have this full agenda, let's just get started. And Heather, if you can just keep letting anyone in that might join a little bit later, that would be great.
Will do. I'll keep an eye on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our discussion today on seclusion and restraint. Before we get into the meeting agenda, I just want to let anyone who has just joined know that we ask that you put your microphones on mute, just so we can get through all of the agenda items that we have today. And there will be opportunities and some points where we might ask you to answer some questions in the chat. And we have moderators who will monitor the chat, and we can ask you to unmute if we need to discuss more at that point. So with that, let's get started. So our agenda today, we're going to do a brief introduction. Some of you may not know much about us, the Social Justice League of Farmington and Farmington Hills. And just for anyone new to our group, we wanted to provide a little bit of a background on that and why we're here today discussing this topic. We also have a presentation. The main reason why we're here, we have a presentation on seclusion and restraint from the Guy Stevens, who is the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and just an amazing resource to teach our community about why these are dangerous practices. And then following that presentation, we will share some limited data that we were able to access on what seclusion and restraint looks like for the past 3 school years in Farmington Public Schools. And then we will have a Q&A and just wrap everything up. So let's get going. So about the Social Justice League, we are a group who is made up of parents, guardians, students, alumni, just community members, all in the Farmington Public Schools district. So that covers Farmington, Farmington Hills, and also parts of West Bloomfield as well. And then we have that school of choice program. So we also are serving some out of district students as well. Anyone is welcome to join, and our mission really is to advocate for equity and social justice and report on that. So we bring information to the community about any social justice issues that may arise in the district, and try to get people to come together to advocate on those issues. Tonight we have 3 moderators. Myself, I'm Amanda Thielen. I am a member of the Social Justice League, and I have 2 students in the district. I have my son, who is a 5th grader, and then I have my daughter, who will be entering kindergarten in the fall. We also have Sunday Taylor. Sunday is a district parent community member. And then we have Heather Finch, and Heather is a member of our Social Justice League, and she's actually in the Saline School District. And they have also had a lot of seclusion and restraint happening in their district. And so we've made these connections, and she will be helping us out and sharing tonight as well. So why are we here tonight? The main reason why a lot of you probably came to this meeting is because there was a recent approval of the new seclusion room at the STEAM Academy. And in our group hearing about this, or some of our group members hearing about this building of the seclusion room on a recent board meeting, we all kind of, the hair on the back of our necks stood up a little bit, because there are a number of us who have actually been advocating against eliminating the use of seclusion and restraint for quite some time now, for years, but it's not something that people really know a lot about and don't really necessarily know that it goes on in our district. And obviously we had opposed that. We had written some letters to the board and spoken at board meetings, and the room was approved a month or two ago. And in the wake of that, we still got a lot of community questions, and we didn't want to end this discussion just because this room had been approved. So we decided to host a community meeting of sorts. And some common questions that we have been getting are things like, why are we opposed to this new seclusion room that we're building at STEAM? Because Farmington has these rooms in other buildings. Well, we're not. We are opposed to all of them, but it really kind of piqued our interest and really disturbed us when we heard about the building of a new room, especially in a building that's supposed to be innovative and using newer practices, because we feel strongly that we should be moving away from these outdated practices and moving towards others. So when we're building a brand new room, that was extremely concerning to us. And if a lot of people watched the subsequent board meeting after the proposal was introduced, where we had some special education staff and principals and things come out and speak about seclusion rooms, and the stance of the district is really that they have to do this. There's not really another alternative, and they don't want to send students out of district. So how can we do without these rooms when the district says we can't? Well, that's part of what Guy will talk about. There are safer alternatives, and it's not something you can just do overnight. It's going to take some time and some training, but those options are out there. Another question, doesn't everyone use these rooms? No, they don't. And I think it's 5 states that have actually banned seclusion as a practice as of now. And there's some proposed legislation to potentially ban it nationally. And what does seclusion really even mean? And, people have been saying to us that it doesn't really seem that bad. Well, some of the things that were said at the board meeting were, I guess, contradicted a little bit in a subsequent meeting that our group had with some special education staff. So we wanted to make sure that we can clear up some of the things that maybe weren't fully explained because of the limited amount of time maybe that they had during that board meeting, and just not knowing the questions to ask. And one big thing that we keep getting is, well, how does this relate to social justice? And social justice is really about equity, participation, human rights, diversity. And you'll see that these practices really disproportionately affect students with disabilities and our Black students as well. And then how can we help? We will hopefully be able to touch on that at the end. We've had a lot of people that ask, what's next? This room has been approved, so where do we go from here? So we want to talk about that as well. And so now for the main event, we have our guest speaker, Guy Stevens, founder of and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if Guy can share what he has. So I will turn it over to you if you're ready.
Okay, and I'm sharing my screen now. So give me 1 second here. And if all went well, you're now seeing my screen.
Yes, yes.
All right, I got a thumbs up. Thumbs ups are always appreciated. Well, first of all, I just want to say, I really appreciate the work that you and the members of this group are doing. It's so critical to have communities become engaged in this and become engaged in making things better. So, I've really, I'm honored to have the opportunity to come talk to you, and, hopefully we can work together and do things better for our kids. So I'm going to talk, as was mentioned, about seclusion and restraint, and why we should be building no more seclusion rooms, and talking about how we can reduce and eliminate these practices, not just in Farmington, but really across the nation. So I'll begin by giving you a little bit of background to who I am and how I got involved in this work. I always begin by saying, first and foremost, I'm a dad. Being a father is really what got me into this work. In fact, prior to beginning the Alliance, and even now, I work for a university and work full-time for a university and work on digital products. But I began this work a little over 2.5 years ago. And I'm going to share that story with you in just a moment. But the most important thing that I am doing with my life is being a father and raising a couple amazing kids. I am the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint. I do believe that we can do better for our students, our teachers, and staff, and families ultimately across the country and across your location as well. And I think that we need to embrace things like neurodiversity and neuroscience to create, safer and more inclusive environments. And, you mentioned this being a social justice issue. Absolutely, there's a civil rights issue here. There's a human rights issue here. And hopefully throughout this presentation, you'll get a better sense of why I say that's so critical. So let me tell you again, being a father and having that as my entryway into this work, I want to begin by introducing you to my son. I have 2 children. I have a daughter, Audrey, who's now 11, and my son, Cooper, now is 15. Cooper's an amazing kid. He loves science. He loves nature. His favorite place is the beach, and a beach within walking distance. And to say he is there daily would be no exaggeration. We live in Maryland. He likes catching blue crabs and actually makes a really mean crab cake as well. And a fantastic kid. Cooper is autistic and has been diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety as well. And as many of you might imagine, he's required some additional supports kind of throughout his schooling. And that's where our experience with restraint and seclusion began. Cooper actually first encountered restraint when he was in the 1st grade. It was never identified as restraint. No one ever said your child was restrained. But what had happened is he was on the playground. He didn't want to come in, and the situation began to escalate. And eventually they said, well, gee, for safety reasons, we had to grab him and hold him and carry him in and put him into an empty office. The words restraint and seclusion were never used. They just said there was a safety issue. When he got in that room, he was very traumatized by what had happened. He was not a fan to start with of physical contact from someone that was not, let's say, in his inner circle. That was something he wasn't comfortable with. And that was kind of traumatic on him. But, again, it wasn't called restraint. It wasn't called seclusion, but it's exactly what happened in that instance. If we fast forward to the 5th grade, from 1st grade until 5th grade, we found a placement for him within our school system that actually worked really well for him. And I'll say that probably the largest reason it worked so well for him was that he had relationships with staff that really worked well with him. And from 1st grade until 5th grade, he progressed really nicely. In 1st grade, he went into a small self-contained classroom. By 5th grade, he had moved back out into an inclusive environment for all but one of his classes. So, kind of the pathway that a kid that needs some extra help might be intended to be on, getting extra help and being successful. Unfortunately, in 5th grade, there was a bit of a tragedy. He had been working with one particular teacher for about 2.5 years, had a very special relationship with this teacher, and unfortunately, she got involved in a car accident. And when that happened, she wasn't able to come back to the classroom. And that was really difficult for him. He lost this person that was really important to him and really helped him when he was having a difficult time. Unfortunately, we worked with the school. We tried to make sure that he was getting the right support that he needed. We certainly looked to what we had in his IEP and looked to, match the impact that was given by that one really amazing teacher. And unfortunately, despite our best efforts, he was having a hard time, and he was becoming dysregulated. He was becoming overwhelmed. We began to see behaviors we hadn't seen for 5 years. When he was in 1st grade, he was an eloper. He would get overwhelmed and he might end up under his desk, or he might end up running down a hallway. Over those next few years, he made tremendous progress. But suddenly, with this new trauma in his life, he began to have difficulty. And unfortunately, 2 situations ended in a very similar way. He eloped, he hid in a bathroom, only to eventually come out and be physically restrained, drugged down a hallway, and put into an empty classroom. And it was extremely traumatic. I actually went to pick him up the second time this had happened. I had never seen him so dysregulated. I had never seen him so upset. He had knocked things over, thrown things, ripped things up, tried to climb out the window. That physical restraint was very impactful on him. In fact, so much so, we had a very difficult time finishing the school year. And ultimately, this was towards the end of the school year. We were able to finish the school year, and that's a very generous way to say it. But as we got into summer, we began to think about what comes next. And we worked to develop an IEP that we thought would be supportive, but we had a lot of concerns. This to us indicated that perhaps the school system didn't have the resources or the training to really support him the way he needed to be supported. And after a lot of soul searching, we ended up deciding to homeschool him. It was not our plan. But, we looked at some private placement options. We looked at developing an IEP. But we took his voice into account, and he was afraid to go back to school. He didn't feel safe. And as a result, we made a very difficult decision and we homeschooled him for the next 2 years. Um, and overall, it went well. Not to say that every day was easy for him or for us, but he did well and he progressed. And we were relatively happy with how things were going. If you fast forward to about 2 years, in 2018, he decided he wanted to go back to school. We had started a little scouting group with some of his old friends to give him kind of more social outlets. And when he did that, he decided he wanted to see his friends more. He wanted to be back in a public school setting. So we worked really hard to develop an IEP and work with the school team to make sure he would be appropriately supported. I knew a little bit about restraint seclusion at that point, but not as much as I know now. And, I had attended some advocacy training courses. I'd done a couple 60-hour programs. I'd always taken my role very seriously in terms of advocating for him. And we worked really hard. We got him back into a program. He was going to be starting off in a standalone classroom again. And unfortunately, despite all of our best efforts, he went back, and over 15 days, he was restrained and or secluded at least 4 times. And I say at least 4 times, only 2 of those instances were actually appropriately reported. And that was only after I put pressure on the school. But we actually think it happened probably more about 7 or 8 times during that 15-day period. At the end of that 15-day period, there was a very traumatic event, a grown man and other staff carrying my son to a seclusion room, forcefully putting him in there, and he was done. He was not going to go back to school. We immediately advocated to get him some support because here we have a child that doesn't want to go back to school, is afraid to go back to school, is not getting a free and appropriate public education. We advocated for home and hospital, which in our state is a program, and you probably have something similar in your state, where they sent a teacher out to our house a couple days a week to work with my son. He did really, we were really lucky with that because they picked a teacher that had been teaching for about 50 years. He was in his early 70s. Mr. Steve is what we called him. We still call him Mr. Steve. My son goes over to his house usually about once a week now and does yard work for him. He's a family friend, but he came over and the first thing he did was develop a relationship with Cooper, got to know him, who he was. And through that relationship, very successfully worked with my son over the remaining period of a year. So this led me to doing a lot of research, and ultimately one day sitting actually in this space, I was having a conversation with my son and I said, look, this shouldn't have happened to you. This was not okay. This is not an okay way to treat people. And I made a promise to him that I would do anything within my power to make sure it didn't happen to him again or others like him. And that's really what led to the formation of what is now the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint. I formed it back in March 2019, so a little over 2 years ago. And I formed it initially because I was doing a tremendous amount of research, trying to look into primary scientific literature, trying to look at alternatives, looking at data, looking at anything I could find about restraint seclusion. And the deeper I dug, the more concerned I became in what I was finding. So I formed the Alliance initially as a way to raise awareness. And ultimately, it kind of grew into not just raising awareness, but we wanted to help people that were in this situation, one, to know that they weren't alone, and two, that they could influence change. So that's been kind of our mission over the last two plus years now. And, our mission, as you can see here, is really about connecting people. So we want to connect people together that are interested in changing minds, laws, policies, and practices, really so that we can reduce and eliminate these practices, because there are far better things that we can be doing. When a school system tells you this is the only thing we can do, it's the only thing that they can do because they have not looked further to see the other things that they can do. And there are many. We're going to talk about those. We have at this point kind of an international network. This is not uniquely an American problem. I talk to people across the world now in Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia. We see these kinds of problems happening across the world. But we've got this great network of parents, of kids and self-advocates who have themselves been restrained or secluded, educators, attorneys, school administrators, and others that help us to spread the word about better things that we can be doing. So that's a little background on kind of who I am and how the Alliance started. What I want to do today is give you some background on restraint and seclusion, talk a little bit about the impact. What is the impact of restraint and seclusion? What are the benefits? What are the why am I concerned about it? Well, what's wrong with using these practices? And I'll assure you, there's plenty wrong with using these practices. We're going to talk a little bit about federal law. And while I'm not an expert on Michigan law, I was doing some research prior to this presentation, and I'll share a little bit of what I found on that with you as well. And then we'll talk about alternative approaches and end with some Q&A. So with that said, I would ask that if you would, in the chat, and I'm not going to read these right now, but if you would take a moment in the chat and tell us who you are, where you're from, and why you're interested in this topic. And again, I really appreciate the work that's being done here by the Social Justice League. I think it's so important for people to come together. And you have so much more power coming together and working on these issues than one voice out alone. So I really commend what you're doing. So to frame this conversation, I want to say that we all want to see safer schools. We want safer schools for our kids, for the teachers and the staff. Nobody wants to see a student hurt. Nobody wants to see a teacher hurt. And of course, we can avoid a lot of these things from happening. Although, I think how to put this, I had a lot of anger about what happened to my son. It shouldn't have happened. It's nothing worse than having your child injured or treated the way that he was treated. But at the same time, as I formed this group, my thought was, how can we be effective? How can we affect change? How can we make sure this doesn't continue to happen? So, I recognize that nobody wants to restrain or seclude a child. They may believe that it's their only choice. And part of our job is to help them realize there are far better things that they can be doing. Now, not to say that there aren't some bad players out there. There probably are. But I would say the majority of people that get into education sincerely want to help children, but they may be using practices that are 20, 30, 40 years old that haven't evolved in the field. So finally, with that, I would just say that, if we can do better, we should do better. And knowing that we can do better and not doing anything about it is the wrong thing. So we absolutely have to do more to help kids and help families. So let's begin by talking about some of the definitions here. What we're talking about when we're talking about things like restraint and seclusion. For this initial part, I'm going to use federal definitions. Now, I'll tell you, we don't have federal law around restraint and seclusion. We do have federal guidance. We're going to talk about that more as we go through, but I'm using federal definitions here just to give you an idea of what does the federal government consider to be restraint or seclusion, and then what did states do with that guidance as they develop their own policies and practices. So if we look at the federal law, it says, restraint is a personal restriction that immobilizes someone. So that person can no longer freely move their arms, their leg, their head, their torso. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's people putting their arms around you, people holding you, something that prior to hearing about restraint and seclusion in schools, I wouldn't have actually imagined it happened. I wouldn't have imagined that kids were actually being restrained and secluded in schools. Restraint sounds like something you expect to be happening in a law enforcement setting, not in a school, especially not to very young children with disabilities. So it was a little bit shocking to me, but that's what restraint is. Now, it's not the same as a physical escort, which might be kind of gently putting your hand on someone's shoulder or their wrist or their arm and helping them to walk to a different location. So there is that distinction there, but it is what it sounds like. And of course, I'm sure many of you have followed the news and have followed trials that are going on now about where restraint has led to death. Of course, in Michigan, you're probably aware of Cornelius Frederick, and then this photo is actually from Cornelius Frederick being restrained in a Kalamazoo, Michigan residential facility. So restraint is physically holding someone to prevent them from moving. And there's different kinds of restraints. There's standing restraints, and this might be done by a single adult. This illustration here really doesn't show the true size differential, because very often the children that are being restrained are 40 and 50 pound, kindergarten, very young students that are being physically restrained. So a standing restraint is just kind of using your body and crossing the arms of the student. We then move into things like seated restraints, where two adults might come alongside of a child and use their bodies to help bring them into a seated position. We then move into supine restraint. And if you read the definition, that it's frightening. A supine restraint begins with a takedown. a takedown. A takedown is exactly what it sounds like. It is taking someone down to the ground. In a supine restraint, it's generally taking them down to the ground and having them on their back. So this is not a face down type of restraint. It's kind of a, you're down on your back. But that moves then into what is known as prone restraint. And prone restraint is like supine. It begins with a takedown, but then the student is rolled over on to their front. And of course, this can be deadly. Any form of restraint is dangerous. So know that any type of restraint, regardless of training, restraint is dangerous. And I'll talk more about that later. Prone restraint is exceedingly dangerous. There have been many deaths, not just of kids in schools, even in law enforcement, where people are put in prone restraints. This is not legal in Michigan right now. And in fact, there's 31 states that have banned prone restraint. So it's something that continually gets worked on. So what's seclusion? This is really important. So seclusion, again, federal definition, it's an involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room or area from which they are physically prevented from leaving. So there's some really important words there: involuntary, alone, and prevented from leaving. It is not the same as a timeout. So if you're with a staff member who is helping you or working with you in some way, it is not necessarily the same as seclusion under the federal definition here. But again, it is involuntary. So how do you get a student to a seclusion room? Most often there's a restraint that precedes the seclusion. If it's involuntary, the child's not going with their will, they are likely being restrained and put into a seclusion space. This is a screenshot of a video that happened in Maryland of a child being put into a seclusion room. This is an actual seclusion room. You can see with the cinder block walls. And what you might see there by the door is a small pool of blood. This child was put into seclusion in the seclusion room, banged his head. They didn't notice he was bleeding until they went to let him out. I want to be really clear here. Seclusion is not the same as a timeout or a kid that needs a minute to de-escalate, a kid that says, hey, I need to be alone for a second. That is not involuntary. If a kid says, I just need to go to a space, I need to be by myself for a second, that's not seclusion. If a kid's going into a sensory room, and again, not against their will, not prevented from leaving, that's not seclusion. I want to be clear, there is nothing that is regulating about being put into a room against your will. People will often tell you that, well, they use seclusion because the kids have become dysregulated and they need to be able to regulate. Regulation's not what happens. What may happen is a child may become so distraught that they wear themselves out, that they become so overwhelmed. Some of the things that happen in seclusion rooms are direct symptoms of trauma. Kids will defecate, they will urinate, they will strip their clothing off, they will bang their heads. There is nothing calming about being put into a seclusion room. And yet these rooms often have names like the calm room, the cool room, the blue room. That doesn't make that any less torturous, to be honest with you. Being put into that kind of space is really, really difficult. And of course, kids don't actually have the ability to self-regulate when they're very young. They actually haven't developed that capacity yet. Kids very much need adult presence to help them to regulate it if they're having difficulty. So another definition I want to hit here is something called imminent serious physical harm. This is really important because if you look at all the laws that exist across the country, they often talk about when you might be able to use seclusion or restraint. The federal guidance is clear. The federal guidance says these things actually are dangerous, and you never want to do these unless there is the threat of imminent serious physical harm. Now, imminent serious physical harm has a definition and a meaning, despite what people may tell you, because I was told when I went to my school district, well, it means something different to you than it means for me. No, absolutely not. It's a group of words with a meaning, and it actually means the same thing as serious bodily injury. It is a life or death situation. Imminent serious physical harm means that there's a life or death situation, something that could cause extreme physical pain, obvious disfigurement, or even loss of a bodily organ or function. This is not a kick, a bite, a scratch, a thrown pencil. This is serious. This is, you do not use these things unless there is this situation. That said, I can assure you, restraint and seclusion most often happen for situations that don't meet this criteria. So, oops, went a little too far here. So what happens in reality is that it's not imminent serious physical harm. Very often these things happen for noncompliance, disrespect, bad language, minor injuries, punishment, property damage, or convenience of the staff. So, and if you put this in perspective, we're going to talk about data here in a few minutes, but the majority of instances of restraint seclusion are happening to our youngest children. They're very young children, often disabled children, autism, ADHD, other types of disabilities, often Black and brown children. But many of these children are children that are, again, 40, 50 pounds. Is it really an imminent serious physical harm? So let's talk about the impact of the use of restraint seclusion. And again, I recognize that some of this is tough to hear. And, we've been doing this work for a while here. And, most of us that are involved have been through this, and it's traumatic. And, as you wrap your head around this, you really need to think about the long-term impacts, not just on the children, but also the families. So again, just be aware that some of this is tough. So first question is, who is often restrained secluded? And I've been alluding to that already. It's disproportionately kids with disabilities. It's disproportionately Black and brown students, most likely to be elementary age students. So very, very young students. And that's interesting because if you look at the curve of restrained seclusion, when you talk about restrained seclusion, the image that might appear in someone's mind, if they are not aware, is a 15-year-old with an attitude problem. That is not the norm. The norm is a very young child. In fact, as kids grow older into middle school and into high school, restraint and seclusion decreases. It's not decreasing because it works. And you can think for a minute why it might decrease. Well, my 15-year-old son right now could probably lift me up. It becomes a different equation when kids become larger. And I think that people are less prone sometimes to try controlling tactics like restraint and seclusion. I'll also say to you that children that are placed in more restrictive settings are more likely to be restrained and secluded. So if you take the spectrum of placement and you go from a general education classroom to a standalone classroom to a regional program to a, let's say, out of district placement that might be a special education day school to a residential facility, as you go up that curve, children are more often restrained and secluded. Now, some would tell you that, well, gee, that's because these are children that have not been successful in less restrictive environments and they are more likely to have behaviors. Certainly kids that go into more restrictive settings may have had issues that have caused them to be restrained and secluded, but the answer to restrained seclusion is not more restrained seclusion. In fact, the truth is, and we're going to talk about trauma in a few minutes, that is the loop that often happens, because the more you restrain and seclude a child, the more likely they are going to feel unsafe and the more likely they are to engage in behaviors that might again get them restrained and secluded. We often see as well that children with a trauma history are more likely to be restrained and secluded. And I would include disability in that category as well, as many children that have disabilities have had traumatic events in their past. Even thinking about something like autism, where you have communication challenges and differences, imagine how frustrating, imagine how traumatizing it might be to be in a world where people don't always understand the way that you're thinking. So we find people that have trauma, whether it's from sometimes it's from abuse, sometimes it's from home situations, sometimes it's economic. There's a lot of causes to that, but children with a trauma history are more likely to be restrained and secluded. So looking at that disproportionality, I mentioned disability. This is federal data, the most recent data from the Office of Civil Rights. And in 2017, 2018, 77% of the kids that were secluded were children with disabilities. 80% of the kids that were physically restrained are children with disabilities. If that is not a civil rights issue, I don't know what is. We're disproportionately restraining children that are children with disabilities. And as you look at Black students, for example, you again find that Black students are disproportionately restrained and secluded. So there is connection there as well. So we know who is affected by restraint and seclusion most frequently. Let's talk about the impact. And at a high level, the impact can be trauma, injury, and even death. These are adversive interventions, and they are used in what are termed as crisis management situations, and they're often used against our youngest and most vulnerable children. So let's begin by talking about trauma. I've learned more about trauma in the last couple of years than I ever imagined I would learn. And, it's because it's very important to this conversation. What happens when individuals are traumatized? And anyone here that has a trauma background, some of these things will probably resonate with you, but we have certain areas of our brain that are related to trauma responses, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. And when people go through traumatic stress, it can actually cause long-term changes in areas of our brain. So for example, our amygdala is kind of our threat detection system. Our amygdala is what says, is my environment safe? It's what puts us into a fight or flight response. Our prefrontal cortex helps us with decision-making, executive function. Our hippocampus helps us with laying down memories. And all of these structures can actually physically be changed by trauma. So for instance, if you know anyone or you yourself have been through trauma, what you might find is people that have been traumatized tend to have an overactive fight or flight response. So they tend to be what we would call hypervigilant. And hypervigilant people are always scanning their world, their environment for danger. Or think of it this way: as an adult, what's going to go wrong next? What's the next thing that's going to happen? And if you take a child that is hypervigilant and doesn't feel safe, we cannot learn if we don't feel safe. So knowing that trauma affects the brain and knowing how it affects the brain is really critical. Because for instance, when you are in a fight or flight mode, you know what happens? A couple physiological changes happen. One is that you're no longer really communicating with your prefrontal cortex. So you're no longer able to rationalize or make decisions in the same way. So let's think about how that affects what I call the classroom cycle of trauma. So imagine for a moment that you have students that come in with a trauma background. If they have a trauma background, and that may be related to disability, it may be related to other factors, that has already caused changes to occur in their brain. And those changes can cause them to be hypervigilant, to not feel safe, to be scanning their environment for danger. That hypervigilance can lead to what we would term as distress behaviors. When you don't feel safe, you might have behaviors that suddenly are interfering with your classroom. And what happens when a child's behavior begins? What happens when they begin standing up, trying to get away, eloping, shouting out? What happens typically is that a staff member may approach them and put compliance demands on them. You need to do this. You need to return to your seat. And those compliance demands can escalate. And as those escalate, the child may begin to escalate as well, to the point where their amygdala, their threat detection system, begins to go into overdrive. That leads to a fight, flight, or freeze type of response. And depending on how that response plays out, Dr. Ross Green would say that we have lucky ones and unlucky ones. A lucky kid might be one that becomes overwhelmed and shuts down, puts their head down on their desk, cries. An unlucky one might be one that tries to run off and hide or push or fights back. And depending on their response, that may lead to punishment, and may lead to restraint, and may lead to seclusion. And then the cycle continues, because as they are punished, as they are restrained, as they are secluded, you're laying down more trauma, and more trauma makes it more likely that they will again be hypervigilant in the future. So again, as you look at that cycle, I often say the use of restraint and seclusion leads to more restraint and seclusion. Using the tactic makes it more likely that a kid will have it used on them again. And schools will sometimes defend their data and say, well, gee, yeah, we have 400 restraints, but 250 of them happen to one kid. That's not crisis intervention. That's poor planning. So when you see restraint and seclusion repeatedly used, it's showing that you have not developed an appropriate accommodation for a child, and you're not meeting their needs. Now, aside from trauma, we know there's physical injuries. There are broken bones, there's head trauma, there's scratches, there's bruises, even traumatic brain injuries that might happen in the process being restrained and secluded. There was a young man, I remember a story about, who during his restraint had adults on his leg, and he had actually led to an amputation because of what happened during that time. The young man here in the photo, his name is Carson. Carson is now, I believe, 20 or 21. He was restrained and secluded when he was very young. Those pictures on the bottom right corner are of his hand. He was forced into a seclusion room, and it broke his hand and foot. And thinking about trauma, to this day, many years later, Carson can't shut the door at night. He still carries that trauma with him. And of course, there are many types of injuries that might occur. And of course, there are injuries that happen to teachers and staff as well. I've got a couple quotes here, and here's a picture of an overturned classroom. I've been punched in the face more times than I could remember. I've been hit in the head with chairs. When you're done, it's exhausting. It's a rare day you don't get hurt at all. So obviously injuries can happen to teachers and staff as well. And the one thing I'll say in that vein is that when you use restraint and seclusion, you are increasing the chance that someone will get hurt, whether it's the teacher, the staff, or the student. Because when people enter into a fight or flight state, they're doing exactly that. This is a survival mode, and people will fight back. And when that happens, people can get injured. So it's important to realize that using restraint and seclusion increase the likelihood that someone will get hurt. And of course, you probably all know that there have been tragic deaths due to the use of restraint. Max Benson, back in 2018, around the same time I began fighting for my son. He was 13 years old, about the same age as my son. He died being held in a prone restraint at a school in California. He was an autistic young man, and I had an opportunity to talk to his grandfather at one point, and nothing will bring Max back, and it should never have happened. You probably all know the story of Cornelius Frederick, who was 16, and he died in a residential facility, Lakeside Academy, after he threw a sandwich. He threw a sandwich in the cafeteria. He was thrown to the ground by about 6 or 7 staff members, restrained him for 12 minutes, and ultimately he died as a result of the restraint. There have been many others, and I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but Michael Reiner Lewis, Angelina Art, Corey Foster, Jonathan King. He was in Georgia, and in 2014 he hung himself in a seclusion room. These tragedies should never have happened, and this is the tip of the iceberg. There are many more. In 2009, the Government Accountability Office actually did a study of this and revealed a number of deaths and mistreatments from restraint and seclusion. And of course, the other issue here that ties into the social justice theme is that, these things that we're doing to kids, the things we're doing to kids are leading them down the school to prison pipeline. So, we are suspending, expelling, restraining, secluding, in some states using corporal punishment. And what you find is our prisons are full of kids that have ADHD or autism or other disabilities. And they begin that very early in school, kind of through how they're being treated and worked with in the school systems. They eventually end up in the criminal justice system. So, this is a huge problem in our society, and something that restraint and seclusion contribute to. There was a great documentary done by a group called Lives of the Balance. And if you know Dr. Ross Green, it's his organization, a film called The Kids We Lose. And if you haven't seen it, you may even want to do that for one of your future meetings. But it highlights kind of the human side of restraint and seclusion. It highlights the human side of the school to prison pipeline, the impact that these things have on kids, on teachers, on staff, and what the long-term impact looks like as well. So again, understanding the impact of these things is really, really critical. So we know who's this happening to. We know the impact. Let me look at the federal law and guidance here. So there are currently no federal laws in place that protect kids from the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. There's been attention to this for many years. If you go back to 2009, the first efforts to pass legislation happened then. There was a House Resolution 4247, and they tried to ban the use of seclusion and reduce the use of restraint. That has not passed, and subsequently there have been efforts to ban the use of seclusion and reduce the use of restraint that have neither passed as well. I mentioned that 2009 report a minute ago. In 2009, the Government Accountability Office did a study, and they realized there was no federal law, but they found cases of death and abuse at public and private schools and treatment centers, hundreds of cases of abuse and death over a decade ago, and yet still we have no federal law that's protecting our children in schools from these kinds of interventions. And I say in our schools because there are federal laws in other settings that protect people from restraint and seclusion, but not in our schools. Now, the federal government has offered some input on the issue. In 2012, they released the document called the 15 Principles document, a restraint and seclusion resource document. I met with one of the authors of this document, and what he told me it was our best effort at the time. It was what we thought was the way that school systems should look at restraint and seclusion. So they put together this document, and basically back in 2012 said, you should never restrain a kid unless it involves a serious risk of imminent serious physical harm. You should always try other things before you resort to restraint and seclusion. You should never use it as a punishment or discipline. You should never use it in a manner that could restrict breathing. Yet we still have 19 states that don't ban prone restraint. We also have 19 states that allow corporal punishment. They also went on to say that, if you're using these things repeatedly, there's a sign of a problem. You should not be using crisis management repeatedly. That is no longer a crisis. That's a failure to plan and accommodate a child. They also said that intervention should be consistent with a child's right to be treated with dignity and free from abuse. I don't think that restraint and seclusion is being treated with dignity. Certainly, we wouldn't pull somebody off the street and throw them into a small cell if they were doing something that we didn't think was appropriate or they were having a difficult time communicating. And then they went on to say that parents should be notified about policies and informed when these things happen. So the federal government provided some guidance, and that guidance was intended for the states to put together their own policies. In 2014, the Senate, trying to push legislation, did a lot of research. This came out of a report. They said there is no evidence that physically restraining or putting children in unsupervised seclusion in the K through 12 school system provides any educational therapeutic benefit to the children. In fact, the use of either seclusion or restraint in a non-emergency situation poses significant physical and psychological danger to the student. This is why the bar is so high. This is why this should never happen except in situations that might involve the real life or death potential. And I don't think seclusion should ever happen at all. End of sentence. Seclusion, there's no place for the use of seclusion. Moving forward in 2016, the federal government, through the Office of Civil Rights, put out what's called a Dear Colleague letter. A Dear Colleague letter is intended to provide guidance to school districts. And that Dear Colleague letter went on to say a number of things, but the main theme of it was, school districts, be aware, if you're not careful with how you use restraint and seclusion, you could be violating the civil rights of children. So the federal government recognized the potential of violating civil rights. And in fact, they went on to talk about that the use of restraint and seclusion can be so traumatic that if a student was only ever restrained or secluded a single time, that they might have new academic or behavioral difficulties that could constitute a denial of FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. Only being restrained or secluded once could lead to a denial of FAPE. So it was obvious the federal government was taking it seriously in terms of guidance, but again, we had no state law. The Government Accountability Office, just a couple of years ago, 2019, we have a mandatory data collection every 2 years, and it's done through the Office of Civil Rights through the Department of Education. Since 2009, they've been required to report on restraint and seclusion data. The Government Accountability Office has reviewed that just recently in 2019, and they said, gee, there's a lot of problems here. The most recent data is showing that 70% of districts reported zeros. Is that true? They were doubtful that it was true. They found, in fact, there were 9 districts with over 100,000 students that had zeros. So the GAO was saying, we've got problems with our data. Department of Ed, you need to do better. So to wrap up the federal piece, I will tell you that there is federal legislation that we are expecting to be reintroduced here probably within the next month or so. It's called the Keeping All Students Safe Act. It has been introduced previously. It would ban the use of seclusion and significantly limit the use of restraint across the country. So rather than states that had laws and states that don't have laws, everyone would be under better standards for restraint and seclusion. Certainly support that legislation. Is it perfect? No. Is any perfect legislation perfect? Probably not. But it would certainly be a step in the right direction. It would ban things like prone restraint or supine restraint. It would also ban seclusion completely. When that comes up, I would encourage you to look at it seriously and think about how you might support that legislation, because there's a lot that you can do to help. So let's look at Michigan. And again, I'm not an expert on Michigan law and policy. I did a little bit of homework just to get a sense of what the policies are. I often talk to people from different states, and before I talk, I'll quickly do a Google search to say, okay, what are the laws? What are the definitions in that state? So I'm just going to share some of these with you. Some of you may already be aware, and some of you may have more recent information than I have, and certainly we can talk about that as we get to the Q&A and discussion. So there is a restraint and seclusion policy. First, in 2006, the Department of Education put forward a policy. In 2016, they adopted some new regulations regarding the use of restraint and seclusion. So there is guidance there. They define seclusion to mean a confinement of a pupil in a room or other space from which they're physically prevented from leaving. And then they go on to say that it doesn't include certain things like an emergency lockdown or fire prevention. But, you know, the definition broadly is very similar. What they don't mention here is involuntary, which I think is an important word to use. But that's the definition for seclusion. They then go on to define emergency seclusion. I'm not quite sure what would be an appropriate non-emergency seclusion, but they go on to define emergency seclusion, and that is a last resort, emergency safety intervention involving seclusion that is necessitated by an ongoing emergency situation that's provided an opportunity for a pupil to regain self-control while maintaining safety of the pupil and others. So what they're essentially saying is, well, we use seclusion to help a student regain self-control. Remember what we talked about with that seclusion room? A seclusion room is not a place of quiet reflection. Kids scream, kids bang their heads, kids self-harm in seclusion rooms. So it's interesting they put it that way. And of course, they say that it's got to be observed. There's got to be people watching that. That's true in most states. And they go on to talk about, lighting and ventilation and other things. They do say that seclusion is not permitted for certain things, so that it's not permitted for preschool children or pupils who are severely self-injurious or suicidal. And they say that it shouldn't be used for the convenience of staff. And it's really, it's unfortunate you have to even include that, right? That you wouldn't think that staff would just shut a kid in a room just to make things better, but they spelled that out. It shouldn't be a substitute for an educational program, a form of discipline, a substitute for less restrictive settings. So, gee, we can only keep your child in our school if we have a seclusion room. That sounds like a substitute for less restrictive alternatives. A substitute for adequate staffing. So, we just didn't have enough staff and this is why we did it, or not appropriate training. And I would say if you were restraining and secluding kids, you probably do not have appropriate training. So, you find that even when there's laws and policies in effect, they're often not being listened to. It goes on to say contraindications need to be considered. And this is interesting, because if you have a law that says contraindications have to be considered, if you have a child that's been restrained or secluded a single time, you could say, well, gee, that has caused a traumatic stress situation, and you could probably get a doctor to write you a note to such to say that putting this child into, and frankly, any child shouldn't be put into a seclusion room or physically restrained. That's can cause things like post-traumatic stress disorder. But you can say, well, gee, this child has a physical or psychiatric condition, and you can have a doctor write a note to that, and that's a contraindication. So whether or not the school agrees and abides by that, that's an entirely different story, but that's what the law says. In terms of restraint, very simple. The basic definition of restraint is restraint means an action that prevents or significantly restricts a pupil's movement. Okay, it's really simple, but they then go on to define emergency physical restraint, and that's defined as a last resort. So all these things say last resort. This is the last thing you should be doing. And again, this should be a situation that involves, a life or death type of situation. And more often than not, that's not the case, even when the policies and laws stipulate that. And again, emergency restraint should not be used for many of the same reasons that we saw with seclusion. So again, this is under the documentation currently in Michigan about restraint and seclusion. It also specifically says that certain practices are prohibited. The language here is really a bit challenging. Certainly corporal punishment is prohibitive, deprivation of basic needs, child abuse, seclusion other than emergency seclusion. And it goes on to talk about mechanical restraint and chemical restraint. I didn't really hit on mechanical restraint and chemical restraint, primarily because they're not typically used in most states, but chemical restraint is using some sort of chemical means. It can be a sedative, it can be a number of things to, restrain a individual, and that's not necessarily outlawed in all states, but in most states it is. Mechanical restraint is typically using some sort of device to restrain someone. So in Michigan they say, well, we can't do that, we don't use mechanical or chemical restraint. But then they talk about those restraints that involve impacts on breathing, such as prone restraint. And then it says any type of restraint, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So you see that there are a number of things that are prohibited through state law. Now, does that mean that your schools are abiding by those? Not necessarily. I found in my experience that very often in schools, they're unaware of what the law says. And even people that you would expect should be aware of what the law says. Somehow, with many of these things, it's like playing a bad game of telephone. At some point, somebody was trained on something related to this. And by the time you get down to a lot of the teachers that are in the trenches, they haven't really gotten the clear information on what is or what is not illegal. And you'll find that often in the things that you're being told. And of course, we know that this has received news coverage in Michigan and across the country. And this story stuck out at me because, emergency interventions needed so often for a 38-pound kindergartner. Again, think about that imminent serious physical harm. Was that child really providing kind of a life or death situation? And of course, the Cornelius Frederick story gained a lot of attention as well in the state. I will tell you, as we mentioned before, and this is really interesting because I know you've done a data call recently, and it looks like maybe you've gotten some of that data back. Data was already technically being reported to the federal government, and Farmington is no exception. They have data in there in terms of restraint seclusion, but I would say based on the data you have and based on this data that there seems to be a problem. This is from the 2017 reporting cycle, and in the district of Farmington, there was, let's see, 1 physical restraint of a student without disabilities, 4 of students with disabilities. Seclusion, only 4 students with disabilities were secluded. That seems rather low. And it makes you wonder why they would need any seclusion rooms, or much less need to build a seclusion room. But again, we can probably see that this data is not accurate, and that's been an ongoing issue. The GAO, as I mentioned before, they have been cracking down on the Department of Ed because this data is just not coming into them in an accurate way. And we see that in states like your own, where there's state level reporting and it doesn't agree with the federal reporting. An instance of restraint or an instance of seclusion should be fairly easy to quantify. So moving on, oops, my deck didn't want to move on here. Give me 1 second here. Let's talk about alternatives. So one of the first questions that was presented to me as I began to advocate against the use of restraint and seclusion locally was, what else do you expect us to do? What do you expect us to do if a child is unsafe? What do you expect us to do? And you can plug in any magic scenario after that. If a child throws a pencil and the pencil bounces off the board and pokes somebody in the eye, what do you expect us to do if someone is kicking someone? Well, first of all, in my state, none of those situations would meet the imminent serious physical harm clause. But I took that question really seriously, and I thought to myself, well, what is the answer to that? What are the alternatives? So I began to do a lot of research to figure out what are the things that we can be doing. We know that restraint and seclusion lead to trauma. We know they can lead to injuries in the students, the teachers, and the staff. We know kids have died being restrained. So if we could do anything to reduce that risk, shouldn't we do that? I mean, isn't it really simple? If we can reduce risk to our kids, our teachers, and our staff, shouldn't we do that? And I think the answer is absolutely we should. So we now have kind of a recommended approach for reducing and eliminating restraint and seclusion. And I'm going to say it in a sentence, and then I'm going to break it down to make a little bit more sense of it. But we often talk about trauma-informed, neuroscience-based, relationship-driven, and collaborative approaches. And I'm going to dive into each of those a little bit more deeply, but I'll begin with trauma-informed. I mentioned earlier how many of the kids that are restrained and secluded are kids that have a trauma background. There was a very well-known study a number of years ago called the ACEs study. And the ACEs study looked at adverse childhood experiences and how they could affect children and ultimately adults throughout their lifetime. And they found some really interesting results in terms of even long-term health of individuals that had been exposed to many adverse childhood experiences. And today, many of the children entering our classrooms are coming from a trauma background. So what are trauma-informed practices? Well, trauma-informed practices, again, we've got only a little bit of time for our presentation today, but so we can't really go into this in great depth, but trauma-informed practices are, one, being mindful of a little of that brain science I mentioned earlier, which gets us into this idea of neuroscience-based. When you begin to understand trauma and how it affects the brain, you can better work with individuals that have been through trauma. And, so trauma-informed approaches are broadly trying to understand the impact of trauma and then trying to work with individuals, kids, in a productive way, being mindful of their traumatic experiences, communicating with them in ways to help them feel safe and seen and heard. When we say neuroscience based, it's not expecting every educator to be a neuroscientist, but if I can learn enough neuroscience to understand the impact that trauma has on the brain, any educator can learn that. And if you understand that effect on the brain, you can much better work with and support children. And relationships. If you ask me my rules of education, I would give you my 3 R's of education, and that is relationship, relationship, relationship. Relationship means so much, and it even means more to the kids that need it most. So kids that have a trauma history, kids that have a disability, relationships are key. Any of you that have had your children in an unsuccessful placement and a successful placement, I would venture a guess that one of the most distinguishing features that set them apart was your child having a really positive relationship with someone. Relationships are really important, especially for people that have been through trauma. And then we need to stop doing things to kids and work with kids. Very often adults are very unilateral in the way that we provide discipline. And when I say discipline, I'm not only talking about kind of the negative things that people think about, but when we provide structure and we provide help and guidance, it's often very unilateral, and we don't listen to the voice of the person that might be involved the most, which is the child. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So the first thing we really need to do is shift our lens on behavior. We spend too much time in our schools looking at the symptoms. We're looking at what the behaviors are, and we're not digging into them deep enough to understand why they're happening. And if we're just looking at observable behavior, we're missing so much. We're missing, is there trauma history? Does their disability, is there something that needs to be accommodated? Do they have unlearned skills that are preventing them from being successful? Are our expectations wrong? Are we expecting too much or too little? How can we adjust our lens to not just look at the fever, the behavior is the fever, but the symptoms, so thinking about how we approach kids is a start to this as well. I'm going to share with you a little bit of data. I live in Maryland in a county called Calvert County. It's a fairly rural county. Out of Maryland school districts, we have 23. Our county would be 16th in terms of size. And that's where my son was being restrained and secluded. We, not one of the larger school districts, but going back to 2017, 2018, 701 seclusions, 2018, 2019, 750 restraints. We had the highest rate of seclusion in the state, the second highest rate of restraint. Why? What was different about our little rural county? Were the kids in our county more risky than other kids, or more problematic? No. It all comes down to ultimately culture and training. But I want you to look at those numbers, 701 and 750. And I would tell you that they're probably underreported, because I know my instances were underreported. So why this happens is it becomes culture in a school. This is how we work with, those kids. I mean, these kind of things that you will hear that are, of course, very, very upsetting. But it's not uncommon for people to think, okay, well, this is the way that we've learned to, if these children are having a problem, this is what we do. And it becomes the tool in their toolbox. And I always hate that word tool, because I don't think tool is a good word for ways that we should be working with humans. Nonetheless, what very often happens is it's the way that people are trained. In our district, we had one individual that was responsible for the crisis management training for ultimately the entire school district. That one individual did train the trainer and would train other individuals. And what we found is that they were really not teaching in accordance with the law. They were encouraging people to use these interventions in situations that they definitely should not have been doing. But, it's how things were done. Teachers were afraid. They were afraid if you took these, tools out of their toolbox that they would be unsafe. So culture is really important to why these things are used. I ultimately began to, in our school district, advocate for change. And I worked with some other parents. I worked with some organizations like the Disability Rights Maryland and the Parents Place of Maryland and others. And ultimately, we were successful in forming a committee in our school district. And that committee included myself, a couple other parents, and members of the school district. We ultimately worked to develop a new policy. And I'm making this sound, I'm giving this a very nice shiny coat of paint, but I can assure you this was not an easy process. There were a lot of things that happened during this process where we were trying to introduce a new policy that went wrong, but ultimately we prevailed. I worked with the Board of Education. We were able to introduce a new policy to eliminate the use of seclusion and reduce the use of restraint. We introduced training alternatives such as UCARU and collaborative practice solutions, and we were able to substantially reduce the instances of restraint and seclusion by a new policy, new training, and a new lens. So let me tell you a little bit about the things that we ended up using. And this is not an endorsement of any one way. To me, there's a lot of things you can do to reduce restraint and seclusion. There's not necessarily a magic, this is the answer. I'll start with talking about UCARU. And UCARU is a trauma-informed crisis management alternative. It was developed by a group called Grafton Integrated Health. They're out of Virginia. And Grafton runs a lot of non-public special education day schools. And they developed this system because they, 15 years ago, were using a lot of restraint and seclusion. They had a lot of injuries. They had a lot of situations where kids were being hurt, staff was being hurt. They were in jeopardy of losing their workman's compensation insurance. They had a new CEO that came in and said, this isn't okay. This is not okay. The way we're working with our staff, the way we're working with our kids, we've got to do something better. He challenged the team to find a better way. And when they couldn't find a better way, they developed a better way. And with UCARU, a lot of what they're teaching and doing is about avoiding crisis in the first place. It's about understanding the brain, about understanding the amygdala. But they have a crisis intervention. And you might see in the lower picture there, there's pads. Well, what they do is if a child truly becomes a imminent serious physical harm, they would use these pads, but not in an offensive way. They wouldn't charge at the kid with the pads. They would use them just to protect themselves, while at the same time backing away and trying to de-escalate the child. So, it's using a very soft voice, hey, I know you're having a hard time. I know, it's trying to help the child out of the situation. And they've been very successful with this program, and in fact now have offered it to many school districts around the world. Really, they've worked with many around, not just in the United States, but around the world. It is a far better alternative than restraint and seclusion. Ultimately, though, we really want to get to the point where we can avoid crisis in the first place. And I will say to you that there's kind of a safety myth that teachers and staff, and this is no different than Farmington. I saw part of the part of the Board of Education meeting. They think they need restraint and seclusion to keep themselves safe. But as I mentioned before, when you're using restraint and seclusion, you're putting people more at risk than you're when you're not using restraint and seclusion. In their long-term data, they reduced restraint, eliminated seclusion, and it led to a cost savings, an increase in staff satisfaction, a decrease in staff turnover, and a decrease in injuries to students and staff. So safety is absolutely a myth when it comes to restraint and seclusion. Another approach I'll mention briefly here is the collaborative proactive solutions approach. Any of you familiar with the work of Dr. Ross Green? He's talked about this in a number of books, The Explosive Child, Lost at School, Lost and Found. It's a model that starts out with this idea that, that the kids sometimes exhibit challenging behaviors because they don't have the skills or they have problems. The philosophy of collaborative and proactive solutions begins with this idea that, really simple thought, kids do well if they can. And that's a really simple thing, but very often in schools, the thought is kids do well if they want to. And if you buy into the thought that kids do well if they want to, when they're not doing well, what do? You offer them incentives, you offer them consequences. Under this model of thinking kids do well if they can, if they're not doing well, you begin to ask questions. What's getting in their way? What skill might they be lagging? And this whole program is really, it's collaborative, meaning that you work with the child. It's proactive, so you're trying to solve problems before they occur. And in this model, we find that many problems are predictable. We know that Timmy has a hard time coming in after recess, and so how can we work on that problem? Well, what we do through collaborative practice solutions is we work with the child to proactively solve the problem. And that involves listening to the child's concerns. It involves showing some empathy. It involves inviting the student to share potential ideas for a solution. It's a really amazing program, and I've seen it used with a very wide diversity of children that have different needs. So I highly respect the work that they've done with collaborative practice solutions, which again has been used to reduce restraint and seclusion. In our county, we introduced both of those trainings. You remember those numbers I shared with you before, 750, 748. In the first year of using new alternatives, they dropped almost 90%, 70 restraints, 78 seclusions. So very positive results. And part of that was just changing the culture. And I'll just point out that even a single teacher can make a big difference. So if you've got a child in a classroom where they're doing some of these practices that aren't working, my son, not much flustered him more than the incentive programs that would be used. Some of the biggest meltdowns we ever had was because my son was promised a reward, which was then pulled back on because he didn't earn the reward. And a lot of these token economies or reward consequence driven models really can lead to a lot of difficulty. But one teacher can make a huge difference, and maybe that's handing a copy of Lost in School to members of the IEP team. Getting people on board that are willing to make a change can make a big difference. I interviewed a teacher named Karen Blatcher a couple weeks ago, and she was a teacher that got some attention after she wrote an article talking about her teaching methods. And she said that all of her students were neurotypical, but she had herself children with disabilities, and she set up her classroom very much like she might have for kids with disabilities, and taught. She provided fidgets and sensory toys and had a calm corner and taught self-regulation skills. And what she found was that everybody benefits when you do those kinds of things. And again, the point here being that one teacher can make a difference just by changing their lens, their mindset, and the things that they're doing. So a couple quick, to wrap this up and get some questions, a couple quick suggestions for you if you want to dive into this deeper and get into more of the solutions. Lost at School by Dr. Ross Green is a really great book that talks about that collaborative and proactive solutions model. Again, when schools say, well, gee, we don't have another choice, there are absolutely choices. In fact, I work fairly closely with Dr. Green, and had worked with him closely when we were doing things within our district, and he's a huge help in all of this. Beyond Behaviors is another great book by Mona Delahooke that I would recommend. It talks a lot about that behavior iceberg, but it also talks a lot about how not all behaviors matter choice. You've probably, if you've had situations that have involved behavioral issues, you probably had all sorts of things said about your child, that they're attention seeking, they're avoiding, they're manipulative, well, not all behavior is actually volitional, and there's science to back that up. Behavior is, though, very commonly focused on just the observable behaviors and not looking below. There's something called the polyvagal theory, which is really insightful, that explains this a lot more. But great book from Mona Delahooke. Lori Desautel's, she has a book called Connections Over Compliance. When I first saw the title of that book, it really resonated with me. She was kind enough to let me read an early release of that, and it's an absolutely amazing book. She teaches a program, excuse me, little too much talking here, in educational neuroscience. One sec. I think I've had too much of a day today talking.
Sorry, take your time.
To say I was on Zoom nonstop today would not be an exaggeration. But usually it doesn't come to a halt just like this. But at any rate, she teaches a program in educational applied neuroscience, and it's about helping teachers to understand the brain. So if you wanted to offer a program to schools to say, how can we learn how to better support children? There are programs out there that do that. And the book is absolutely phenomenal, Connections Over Compliance. And of course, there's a lot of other amazing resources out there as well. To me, having some background in trauma can be really helpful. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is a great one. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry is a great book as well. And then Punished by Rewards. For a long time, I believe the solution was rewards and consequences, and it eventually, eventually I realized that it was the rewards that were often causing more problems than helping them. But that's a great book that goes into talking about how rewards and consequences are really the same thing. It's a way to manipulate children's behavior, and really rewards and consequences are good at one thing, and that's short-term compliance. It's not really teaching kids the skills they need to be successful. So a lot of great resources out there. In terms of a conclusion and take-home message here, one, don't talk on Zoom all day long or you might lose your voice. The other is that, we really can make our schools safer for our students, for our teachers and our staff, while eliminating and reducing the practices of restraint and seclusion. We should technically all really want the same things. Unfortunately, it's often not easy to get there, but it is possible. There are absolutely ways to reduce these practices. I've talked lightly about a couple of them. I'm always happy to come back and talk to you more about specifics if you want to dive into any of those programs. Also happy to connect you with people like Ross Green or Kim Sanders of Ukero, other people that are willing to share with you the things that they've done. And of course, as I've said, these things that we can do, they're going to really make everyone safer. We're going to reduce risk by eliminating these practices. And again, there are far better ways. And if we can do better, again, I would say if we can, we must. We have an obligation. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can open it up to questions and answers.
If we can really quickly, before we open it up for questions, I'm going to share my screen briefly again, because I do want to share some of that data that we have. So bear with me for one sec. Okay. So is everyone seeing my screen? Good. So here is some information that we got from michiganschooldata.org. I did submit a Freedom of Information Act request back in about mid-March to the district for this data, and really broken down very specifically, because when it's supposed to be reported to the state, they have to report things like the individuals involved in the seclusions and restraint, the race of the child, the disability status of the child. And so we had submitted that, but we got a cost back last week of $3,300 to get that data. And so, we are a volunteer group. We don't have any, we don't, raise money. We don't have money. And so that was a little bit cost prohibitive, to say the least. So we have submitted a new request that's using the language of the law very specifically. So I'm hopeful that by asking for these documents in the exact same format that was submitted to the state, or should have been submitted to the state, will get us some more detailed information. And also we did submit a request to the state of Michigan for the same data as well. So it's possible that we might get it from the Michigan Department of Ed a little bit quicker. I'm not sure. But that said, there is some information available on michiganschooldata.org that has very top line information on seclusion and restraint. And so we downloaded the last 3 years that were available: 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019, and 2019, 2020 school years. And so this is a little bit of a snapshot of what seclusion and restraint looks like in Farmington Public Schools. In this graph, you will see that the number of students restrained is in the blue bar. The number of seclusions is in orange, and then gray is the number of restraints. I will say that this is just students with disabilities, because if you look over to the table on the right, you can see that we had very little data submitted for students without disabilities. So we focused on the students with disabilities, because anything less than 10, they don't give an actual number and it would skew it. But one thing, as I was listening to Guy speak, a few things stood out in my mind that I was thinking when I saw this data. You know, we have, for instance, in 2017-18, we have 19 students restrained or secluded. And they're restrained or those 19 students were secluded 190 times and restrained 188 times. So that does show that, in my mind, and it at least implies that we are secluding and restraining the same children over and over and over. And you can see we have the same type of situation in 2018-2019. The number of seclusions and restraints actually went down that year. But then if you look at 2019-2020, what's concerning to me about this, there's more students. And even though the numbers are less than 2017-2018, we have to remember that we weren't physically in school for,
Right.
the last trimester, we'll say, of that school year. And so it was obviously on track. It already exceeded the year prior and was on track to be even more than that. So that was concerning to us to see, but we're hoping to get that in more detail so that we can break it down a little bit further. This chart is going to be impossible for you to read, but I wanted to be very transparent. Transparency is something that we always ask for. And so I wanted to make sure that we were showing all of the Oakland Schools ISD and not just picking and choosing districts when we were sharing data. But we will make these charts available to everyone on our social media and probably our website after this meeting, just if you want to look at it, but also it's available on michiganschooldata.org as well. So we have all of the districts in the Oakland Schools ISD for 2017-2018. We just saw the numbers on the previous slide, but you'll see Farmington was number 5 in the number of students secluded or restrained and had the most seclusions and the most restraints that were reported because, as Guy had said, there's evidence that these numbers are usually, they can be underreported. But that's obviously very concerning, being the number 1 district with seclusions and restraints. And then if we look at the following year, 2018-2019, we're still really high up in the pack. Number 5 of the number of students secluded or restrained, 5th number of seclusions, and the second one number of restraints. And then last year, 2019-2020, we were number 2 all across the board in terms of seclusions, restraints, and the numbers of students secluded and restrained. So looking at these numbers are very concerning to us, and we're hoping that we can get some more details beyond this and that we will share out with everyone as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting and not surprising that you've been stonewalled by getting a high cost estimate to provide you with additional data. And you may want to consider reaching out to some of the local disability rights organizations, because you might find that organizations like, and I don't know what yours is, but the Disability Law Center in your state, they may be willing to make a request on their end. So those kinds of things are always worth checking as well. It's really frustrating, though, to see the things that sometimes will be done to try to prevent people from getting data that should be made freely available.
Right. Okay, so now I will stop sharing so we can talk about, or we can take questions and answers. I know Heather will be moderating, but if you have questions, if you can put them into the chat, then we will ask them in the order that we get them. And so we'll open that up.
Or if you don't want to type out your whole question, you could do a little synopsis and let us know.
Yeah, and I'll say that I was trying to look at some of the comments in the chat as you were kind of going through those numbers, Amanda, and I do see one question there from DW that says, can't you get the information from the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights data? And that was something I mentioned earlier. In fact, I shared some of that data from the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. And interestingly enough, the data from the Office of Civil Rights is far under the data that you were able to get through the system. So there's a huge problem with the Office of Civil Rights data. It's been investigated by the Government Accountability Office, but there are significant gaps in data being reported, sometimes at a state level and federal level. Those numbers in theory should match. They often don't.
I'll ask a question if I can. And since we don't have a large group, if everyone else is okay with it, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'm fine with that as well, unless, yeah, okay, everyone's nodding, yes. But you said, I believe, Guy, is it 5 states that have banned seclusion?
Yeah, 5 states have banned seclusion. The most recent, I believe, was Hawaii in 2016. And you know, I mean, I'll tell you that there are states that have banned a lot of things that are still happening. So even in states that have banned certain forms of restraint or seclusion, sometimes these things are still happening. While it's a step in the right direction, you know, and one of the things that I'd say to you in terms of thinking about the legislative response is that I support federal legislation on this. I think that we should have federal legislation on this, but having a new federal law tomorrow won't solve the problem. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to get the right approaches into our schools so that people are able to more successfully work with kids and reduce and eliminate these practices. So having a federal mandate that says thou shalt not do this is a good thing, because it may force schools to say, oh, gee, we have to look at alternatives. But there's going to be some time, and anything we can do, you know, you can advocate, of course, on a local level, a state level, or federal level. I recommend advocating on all 3, but you may get progress in different areas in different time frames. The quickest change you can make would be at a local level, but if that goes nowhere, escalating to a state level. And we're having a conversation recently with Ross Green and a couple other allies that we're working with, and talking about wanting to push for laws across 50 states next year. You know, unless federal legislation suddenly makes its way. But I would encourage you all to think about, you know, reaching out to your state representatives as well, if you haven't done so already.
Looks like we do have one comment in the chat from Jennifer. She's wondering if with the pandemic, if having restraints or restraining children would actually violate the social distancing rule. And how that would
yeah it's a really interesting thing. So in Maryland, our Department of Education, our Maryland State Department of Education, actually was providing guidance on people, was planning to provide guidance on the use of restraint and seclusion under the circumstances of the pandemic. And they retracted that guidance after a group of advocates in the state basically said, COVID doesn't change anything. The law is the law. You know, you can't restrain a child for anything less, you know, so COVID doesn't change it. You know, I mean, granted, you should be, you know, because the tone of it was, well, gee, we should be more careful. It's like, no, you should always use that as a last resort. So, you know, I would say that COVID doesn't change it. What has changed is, I'll tell you that from the people in our community, one of the things that I've heard is a lot of children have been not been in school and have been in home over periods of the pandemic. And as a result, they weren't being restrained and secluded. Some kids actually improved markedly once they were no longer in school. Now, that said, there are children that really probably suffered as well because they needed a certain level of support. But, you know, COVID has had impact. One of the greatest impacts that I worry about is the fact that we have all now been through a global pandemic. We've all been traumatized by being through a global pandemic, especially our kids. And as kids are returning to school, and that's happening at different times in different places, but as kids are returning to school with that new trauma on top of any old existing trauma they had, we may see an increase in challenging behaviors because of the trauma responses the kids have been through. So I think that COVID has a deeper, a deeper impact in that, you know, kids might be coming back having been exposed to the new traumas. Adults have been exposed to new traumas. And it's not just the kids that are affected by their trauma, it's the adults as well. And adults that have been through trauma have some of the same types of reactions. They may be more likely to go into a fight or flight mode. So there definitely is an impact.
I know for in my case, we were really worried about when he is to go back to school, you know, with there being new and different rules. you know, of having to wear a mask and having to stay apart from each other, that when you have a kid who's already the bad kid and is already, you know, in that loop of, you know, having restraint seclusion used on them, then you throw on, well, here's even more rules, the kid who struggles with changes in the first place, and saying, well, how does that play out? And of course, we haven't really gotten an answer on that.
Yeah, and I always hate to hear that, you know, kind of the bad kid, because that's so reflective on the kids as well, is that if you're being told you're the bad kid, and you know, it's really
like a
terrible.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yep.
Yeah, I see a question from Kelly here. Oh, sorry. How can you address how neurodivergent students can be better served without seclude and restrain?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that, you know, some of the programs that I talked about, like UCARO and Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, are absolutely appropriate for neurodiverse students. In fact, both of those approaches are also used with non-speaking children. And you think about collaborative practice solutions, people often think, oh, well, gee, this probably wouldn't work for, you know, some students, and absolutely, you know, it's been used with a lot of different kinds of kids. You know, I think that, you know, again, this gets back to some of the things I was talking about early on, but you know, kids that, you know, neurodivergence. I mean, you're talking about, you know, kids that may have some kind of trauma history related to their own neurodivergence. You know, again, think about autism, and think about being autistic in a world that, you know, doesn't, you know, that makes it challenging to communicate and be understood. So I think that trauma-informed practices are always helpful to anyone that you're working with, but especially kids that may have a trauma background, may have, you know, maybe neurodivergent as well. And you know, what I would say is, you know, beyond that, there's so much emphasis often in what needs to change about the kid. And isn't it amazing that we look at the 7-year-old or the 8-year-old, and we think that all the change needs to happen with the child? The greatest change that needs to happen is most often with the adult or the caregiver or the teacher. And it's changing our lens, our expectation. You know, what happens when a situation's escalating, as I talked about kind of in that trauma cycle, and all you're doing is placing more demands on child that they've already not been able to meet the first demand, yet you're piling additional things on them you want them to do. So, you know, I think one of the greatest approaches that you can take is changing the way that you approach situations yourself. There are a lot of different things that you can use, and, you know, I mentioned a couple examples. Another training program, in fact, I did some training in this today, a program called Low Arousal. Low Arousal is a UK-based program, and it comes from Professor Andrew McDonnell, who wrote a book called The Practitioner's Guide to Low Arousal. And low arousal is basically reflecting, the reflective journey is the subtitle of the book, but it's kind of reflecting on your own interactions with a child. An escalated adult cannot de-escalate a child. A stressed adult cannot help a child who is feeling stressed. So there's a lot that needs to be done internally. And of course, you know, trauma-informed approaches, it's not just about understanding and supporting the trauma that children have been through, but adults as well, you know, because we've all been through things, and some have been through very traumatic things. There's a school in Tennessee, Matthew Portell, if any of you are familiar with Matthew Portell, he's a principal of a school called Fall Hamilton Elementary, if I'm not mistaken. And he took over as principal, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. And his goal was to turn the school into a trauma-informed school, to put a trauma-informed approach on everything that they were doing. And that wasn't just for the kids. He found ways, like, you know, let's say a teacher was in a classroom and had reached that point where they just couldn't add any more onto what they were doing. They were overwhelmed. An overwhelmed teacher is not going to make appropriate decisions or support kids appropriately. So he had a system of tapping out, that a teacher could have somebody else that would come in and take their place if they were becoming overwhelmed. So there are so many things that we can be doing. And the things that we do for all children are really going to be benefiting all children. So I would say, you know, again, thinking about, you know, students with disabilities, you know, many times the approaches that we have in our schools, you know, and I don't want to pick on anything in particular, but I'm going to mention things like PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports. Some of these programs are structured in a way that they will work probably with the kids that need them the least. The kids that really have, challenges are probably not going to be helped by these programs, are probably not going to get the special incentives that they would get or go to the party or do all the things. And the kids that can do well under those frameworks, they probably don't need them. It's the kids that really need help that we're failing. So there's a lot of things that we can do differently.
Thank you. I see another question here from Kelly and Evan. This is thoughts from Guy about culture change about the culture change piece. Suggested actions, more shared conversations, possibly group reads of suggested book titles.
Yeah, absolutely. And culture change is a big one. And I would say to you that sometimes you've got to take this on many fronts. And there's, think of how to put this the best way. While we have every right to be angry and upset, we also need to find allies. And allies can come in lots of different shapes and sizes in terms of maybe your allies, maybe you've got an ally at the school. You've got a teacher that really feels in her heart that the things we're doing are not the right things to be doing, but I just don't know what else to do. Maybe it's a supervisor in special education. Maybe it's somebody else, but you also have an opportunity to win allies. And to win allies, I think you've got to follow an approach that sometimes is hard to do because, any of you that have been doing any work on IEPs or any of that, some of you may have read books like Emotions to Advocacy. It's hard to separate ourselves sometimes. I was very angry about what happened to my son. I still am. The one thing that we never got, that we'll probably never get, is an apology. But nonetheless, I knew that the most important thing here was to affect change, and to do that, I had to work with the system to some degree and try to win people over to my side. And sometimes that happened conversation at a time. One of the reasons that I think we were successful in implementing change in our school district was I began having one-on-one meetings with members of our Board of Education. The information that they were getting prior to our meeting only came from the superintendent and was often not the best information. But I went in and I shared our story. I had photos of my son. I talked about our story and explained to them the things that we can be doing that are different, and was able to make allies. And I think you can also make allies. So that, getting people on board, help to get more people on board. Ultimately, leadership is really important. I'll never forget, I worked with an assistant superintendent. We had a pretty tough relationship at first because I was the one pushing on the system. And, she was, I don't want to say defending the system, but kind of in that role. And I pushed really hard. And at the same time, I did it in a way, that it wasn't personal, but it was, here's my data. Let's talk about this. And, sometime later, we became, friends is probably not quite the right word, but definitely allies. I helped them to set up work with Dr. Ross Green, and I was in Maine the same time they were for a conference, and they invited me to the meeting that they were having with Dr. Green, and bought me lunch and said, "Hey, we're all on the same page here," and was able to help that culture change. But it takes time. But getting some leadership involved in that change can make or break it. If you can't get the leaders on board, people can have all the great training in the world and not get the improvement they need. So hopefully that helps. But it's a gradual process. On a team level, absolutely. I've been known to give copies of Lost at School to IP teams. Make relationships with people. There was a special education supervisor that I worked with who I really had a lot of respect for, and she was very helpful in supporting what I was trying to do. Those are great things. If you could talk, a small group into doing a book study or considering a different training through maybe a special education PTA or other group like that, that might be worthwhile as well.
Do we have any other questions in the chat? We can't see it right now.
Yeah, and if
Yep.
anybody wants to put their hand up and ask a question too, I mean, I'd be happy to take a couple more questions. I promise I have more voice left.
So the discrepancies with the data, sorry, this is Sunday. So the discrepancies with the data that we have, where I think what you showed through ORC was like 4. And then we have like for the same year, like 188. Do you see those other places? And what do you think accounts for that since you've worked with other districts?
Yes, absolutely. I'll mention Fairfax County, Virginia. Fairfax County, Virginia is one of the largest school districts in the country. They're a very wealthy school district as well. They were called out specifically for misreporting data. They're now under a very large lawsuit that involves a number of plaintiffs, as well as organizations like the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, Communication First, and others. And that all comes down to misreporting data. In our county, I looked at the same thing. I looked at the data at the state level and at the federal level and found the same kind of discrepancies. And the answers I got were just absurd. Well, gee, it's a different process. It's not the same people that enter these things in. And, it's a lot of excuses. I mean, this is not complicated. I mean, honestly, it amazes me that people can get away with just kind of saying, well, gee, we don't know what happened exactly. They tried to blame the survey at the state level for differences in numbers. So then I managed to get a copy of the survey and I said, well, which part of this was unclear? Because it looks like the criteria is the same for the Office of Civil Rights. So I guess the truth is, yes, we see those problems happening all over the place. One of the things that you can do, and again, I've got some ideas of there's a whole world of things that you can do to influence change. And if I sat here and told you every one of them, it would be overwhelming. But you can reach out to the Office of Civil Rights. If you have someone that's within the time limit to file a complaint, you could file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. You could reach out to them and talk to them about the data discrepancy. I've also been working with people at the Department of Justice that are very interested in systemic issues. So if you sense that you're having systemic issues, let me know and I can put you in touch with people that can help with those kinds of issues as well. So yeah, it's disappointing. I don't think there's any reasonable explanation other than, it's human error, it's different systems, it's, because I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to reconcile in our county. Well, show me how you collect it for the state report. Well, how does that then move into the federal system? And nobody could answer it. It makes absolutely zero sense. I wish I had a better answer for you, but there are, things that you could do if you're concerned about this. The challenge here is, how can you potentially work in a positive way with the district? You've got to kind of weigh the options. Like at one point, I certainly was considering legal options, but those remained in my back pocket as I thought, well, gee, can I collaborate? Can we work towards change together? So you have a lot of options that can be in your back pocket. And maybe some of that varies on how willing to work with you the district may or may not be.
Thanks. I see.
100%.
Oh, did you have something? Okay. I see another one here from Jennifer, talking about self-care practices like meditation, yoga, journaling, and she asks if restraints and seclusion rooms are to be banned from schools, would schools encourage self-care methods like meditation, yoga, or journaling?
Yeah, Jennifer, that's a great question because you often find that some of those things that you mentioned are part of approaches that may be included. So I think about the work of Dr. Lord Desautel, who teaches the educational, or let's say applied educational neuroscience program for Butler University, and they teach a lot of those kinds of practices, which are, a lot of it has to do with your autonomic nervous system and how we can connect with our nervous system when we are in distress or when we're having a hard time. So, we've all heard things like, oh, well, breathing. Well, sure, that's something you can do. But there's a lot of other things that you can do that are practices like that. So Jennifer, to me, and Jennifer, I'm glad to see you here tonight. Jennifer, somebody that I've had a chance to talk to before. To me, a solution involves a lot of pieces like that. When you're talking about trauma-informed approaches, when you're talking about neuroscience-aligned approaches, there are a number of things that we should be considering in and it's not just what do we replace restraint and seclusion with, it's how do we put in a framework that's going to help us to reduce and eliminate those things, and certainly elements like that might be included.
Anyone else have a question before we wrap it up? Not seeing any hands. Well, thank you so much for holding this session for us. Oh, actually, we have one more question. Donald Walker is one of our school board members and wants to know how he can contact you.
Absolutely. In fact, let me do this. I'm going to reshare my screen for a second because I actually had that information ready for you. So bear with me for 1 second here. And so hopefully, again, you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
Okay. So you can, and I encourage you to, I really do. If you have any questions, if I can help in any way with what you're doing, in your location there in Farmington, or with anyone at the school board, I'm happy to connect you with others as well. My email address is Guy Stevens, and that's with a PH at endseclusion.org. We have a website there as well, which is endseclusion.org. This is my cell phone number. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. I'd also encourage you, we are on social media. We've got a group called the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint there on Facebook, and very active community there. We've got almost, I think, 12,000 people that are part of that community now. And we're trying to share, what are better things that we can be doing, and how can we support people. So absolutely, feel free to reach out to me.
You'll definitely be hearing from me. We need to have you and Celine too.
No, I'd be happy to. And the more of these conversations that we can start, the way I look at this is any progress we make is positive. It's a little overwhelming at times. The fact that we made some progress in our local school district, that's a step in the right direction. We tried to push some legislation at the state level this year that did not end up going through, but you know what? I'm not going away. I'm going to be back and going to have more. So the more of these conversations that we can start, because we really need to do better. I mean, I can just tell you, my son is in a placement now that is really successful for him, and he's doing great. He's a great kid. I can tell you though, that was a challenge. We found a placement that we thought would be appropriate. We were able to get the school to pay for that placement. But some of the placements that would have been considered normally are places where he probably would have been restrained and secluded more, where he would have been traumatized more. And we've got to stop this cycle. I mean, we need to be doing better for our kids. And ultimately, again, there's nothing anti-school or anti-teacher here. We want to do better for everybody. We've got to get the word out. So anything that I can do to support what you're doing, let me know. And thank you so much for the great work that you're doing there.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I do want to mention that we did record this, so we will share, I'm not sure how we'll share it, but we'll try and share a link out so that people who were unable to attend, if you know anyone that was unable to attend, I heard we had a couple of people who at the last minute had something else come up. So share that out, because I think this is just so powerful. Thank you so much, Guy, for sharing that with us. And I think that's it from our standpoint.
Thank you, Heather, for coming in and helping us out here. And
Yeah,
Guy,
My absolute pleasure. This was fantastic.
I appreciate it. We're better together.
Yes. All right, everyone. With that, then I will say good night and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.